Okay, good morning, everybody. And welcome to HHH, History Half Hour. And today we are celebrating 250 years of the United States and the lady known as Emma Lazarus, who, interestingly enough, a number of people have never heard of, but you will by the end of this half an hour session. Now, this celebration of America is going on in many, many institutions. I only received this morning from the Israel Library that they too are doing something to commemorate and celebrate the founding, as it were, the Declaration of Independence of July the 4th of 1776, the 250th anniversary now, as being something special. Brought to the world a country and an independence which was going to give ideas of freedom, of emancipation, of enlightenment, as the world was not seeing. Now it's the 250th anniversary of when 13 of the great British colonies of America broke away. And one of the reasons they broke away was due to excessive taxation, which shows that the issue of taxation is always something to be upset about. And there in America, they were very upset about their taxation, which they felt they didn't need to actually be paying. And the Declaration, which came out of America, is slightly different from the emphasis and philosophy of the Declaration, which would be from France. But the Declaration stated that people have natural rights, and including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, without going into the actual meaning of what the pursuit of happiness is, we can probably imagine that everybody should be able to live a good life without sadness and without trouble. Now, the Jews were not signatories in any way to the Declaration. This is something where the Jews were not actively involved with the signing of this Declaration. However, there were many Judeo-Hebraic concepts which influenced the Christian founders, who themselves came out of a world which was often very Christian in its thinking. The initial design of the seal for the United States, which was instituted by Thomas Jefferson, showed Moses crossing the Red Sea. And this would be an iconic image of liberation. And this would be used in American politics all the way through into the 20th century as an idea of people coming from slavery into freedom, as shown by Moses crossing the Red Sea. Now, the Liberty Bell, which was rang during the proclamation of the Declaration of Independence, actually quoted from what we would say is the book of Vayikra, which we would say, and they would say, for the book of Leviticus, and it said, proclaim liberty throughout the land. That has to be the initial ideas of the Declaration of Independence, that wherever you lived and whichever part of this great new country, as it was in a way, would be proclaiming liberty absolutely everywhere. And it then went on to say, in again a very Judeo-Christian manner, the Declaration said that all men are created equal. Didn't actually say all people, but it said all men are created equal. And that wasn't quite that all men were, but nonetheless, it was on the road to that. And it gave this idea and these ideas which came forward in this Declaration of Independence of 250 years ago were something which Jews could aspire to, which Jews in this new land would see as optimism, and they were in America ahead of the rest of Europe. Europe did not have the ideas, they may have the thinking towards the ideas, but they didn't have declarations as of yet of ideas of independence and freedom for Jews as they did in America. It was the United States Declaration which was the factor in the French Revolution of 1789. So the French Revolution was coming after the American Declaration of Independence. It is not America that was inspired by the French, but the French that were inspired by America. When Louis the 16th, he actually was involved. There was the war which had gone on in the 18th century involving Great Britain and America and France, that America was in fact siding with the French against the British, and Louis the 16th of France financed, therefore, much of the funding of the American Civil War. France supported the United States in revenge against what Britain was doing. Because when Great Britain declared war in France in the 16th century, which was known as the 7 Years' War, eventually France lost the 7 Years' War. Therefore, there was this antagonism which went on between Britain and France, but there was a relationship which happened between France and America. Now, to commemorate the French Revolution, in a way, the Eiffel Tower was built some 100 years after the revolution in 1889. This iconic image of Paris, of France, of what it is to be French, was built, of course, with controversy. There's nothing built without controversy. And it was at the time to be a temporary erection. However, they discovered that it was rather good as an aid to military and radio transmissions, and therefore they allowed it to be permanent, and that's how it is today. It's a permanent structure there in Paris, which was used for military and radio means. Now, to cement the friendship between France and America, their shared belief in the liberty, France donated to America. And the first site they were going to send something to was a site which people saw when they came in their millions to America, as we've discussed before, which was they arrived in what then was Castle Garden, which is before the use of Ellis Island. And Castle Garden between 1855 and 1891 was the position and the place and the area that millions of immigrants, and Jewish immigrants, about 2 million, came from Eastern Europe and came to America. Later on, Ellis Island would be the iconic appearance which all of us know. And this would be the image that people saw. Whether they knew what they were going to be seeing when they were traveling from Eastern Europe, it's something else. How would they have known? But the Statue of Liberty, they would say, quoting, "There is Ellis Island," shouted an immigrant. The name acted like magic, and that would be after 1891. Now, this edifice, this magnificent statue, was known as Liberty Enlightening the World. And today, this Liberty Enlightening the World is better known as the Statue of Liberty. And it was designed by Frederick Bartholdi, and the statue was based entirely on the Roman goddess of liberty, Libertas, and with a crown on her, with a broken chains beneath her at her feet. And the actual structure internally, the metal structure, was designed and constructed by Eiffel, who would be the engineer, of course, of the Eiffel Tower. So there was this strong relationship between France and America, and France donated to America what we would know as the Statue of Liberty. The actual Statue of Liberty took 9 years to complete, and it stands at around 305 feet. Or how do you get a structure of 305 feet from France to America in a ship? Well, obviously that would be impossible. And therefore what they did was they transported it in 350 pieces. 350 pieces of the Statue of Liberty. They were broken, it was broken up and transported by ship, and it took a 1-month journey to get there. And it was reassembled in New York, and it stood on Liberty Island, thus the Statue of Liberty. And it was placed on a plinth funded by the newspaper publisher Joseph Pulitzer, famous Pulitzer Prize, and dedicated in 1886. the same year actually that Coca-Cola was invented, as we dealt with last week. Now, the Declaration and all its sentiments of equality were attractive to Jews and others, and they flocked into the New World. Herman Melville, who you may know as the author of Moby Dick, wrote in the 19th century, "On this Western Hemisphere, all tribes and peoples are forming into one federated whole. The seed is sown and the harvest must come." It was full of optimism and goodness and a new harvest. Now, immigrants were sought. America actually wanted millions of people into their empty lands, and they encouraged and they brought over Jews. And Jews saw the new land as the land of tranquility and advance and golden Medina, away from the tyranny and hatred, especially of Eastern Europe. But we've all dealt with Jewish history before. Jewish history is not quite always as even as we would like it to be. And the harvest which was spoken of by the author of Moby Dick wasn't quite the harvest which the Jews wanted at that particular time when they arrived in the land. And there were still the old hatreds, as Jews were now being accused in America of having, quote, taken over. And as the century came to its conclusion, America was struck by depression. So it's not just in the 20th century depression, there was a great major depression at the end of the 19th century. And the depression was dominated by what was known as the Panic of 1893 and went on for 4 years. Millions were out of work. Millions had unrest and there were labor strikes. And suddenly there was talk of not free immigration, but restriction. And there was talk that certain people had to be to blame for the depression which existed and the way things had moved. And there was a rise, as you would get, more Jews, more anti-Semitism. No Jews, no anti-Semitism. But there were plenty of Jews now in America, and there was anti-Semitism. But let us return now to the Statue of Liberty. For as I said, there was this magnificent statue built on a plinth, and the plinth would have on it welcoming words eventually. Let us now look at a lady known as Emma Lazarus. Many people have never heard of her. She was born in 1849 to a Portuguese Sephardi origin. Her father was a sugar refining industrialist, highly successful, and being of a wealthy background, Emma Lazarus didn't need to work. Not really. Not that many women worked at that time necessarily, but she didn't need to work, and she could apply herself, even at a very young age, to those things which she would love. And the family which she came from was quoted as being one of the best known and the oldest Hebrew families of the city. She was a shy, a sensitive girl, but she had a gift for languages, and even at the age of 14 was managing to translate French and German poetry. A few years later, still very young, she would be translating the works of Hugo and Schiller and Heinrich Heine, and she knew Italian, and later on she would also knew Hebrew as well. She was armed with French and German and Hebrew and Italian, and it said by the year 1881, the year of the assassination of the Tsar, she was therefore able to translate poems and became known as one of the best translators of Heinrich Heine. That her translation of Heinrich Heine, even at her young age, was better than most. Age 40, a bit later on, there were now 2 volumes of the poems of Emma Lazarus, and they were published, and she was known as an exceptional poet. She, in her life, also became associated with Jewish poets, and she was particularly interested in medieval Spanish Hebrew poets, and she read all of them in German. So their works were translated into German, and she then, as an American, read their works in German. She was interested in Yehuda Halevi of the 12th century. She was interested in Moses ibn Ezra of the 12th century and Solomon ibn Gabirol of the 11th century, with whom she connected because she was frail and unwell much of her life, and she saw that his frailty and his early death gave her an association with a particular individual. She read, as I said in German translation, these poets, all of them, played a major role in her Jewish awakening and connections with Spanish Jewry, which in a way were her origins. Now, her relationship with Judaism and Jewishness was interesting. She was similar to many thousands and hundreds of thousands of Jews who were dissociated from traditional Orthodox Judaism, and she did not accept, did not observe everyday laws, everyday rituals, and she saw herself, as she said, outside of the church. She was not a regular Jew. She wasn't a person who went to synagogue or observed all the rituals that others may be doing. And she joined a band, as I said, of many, many people who were also outside of the church. But she didn't reject her religious beliefs. And she found herself, in some ways, through her poetry, she was part of the divine movement of the world. She saw him embraced with the divine. By 1881, the year of the pogroms, which affected world Jewry so much, she was more interested in writing on Jewish themes and defending Jews against anti-Semitic writings. In response, she read a Russian journalist who not only observed the fact of the pogroms, but blamed the Jews for the pogroms. Said this Russian journalist with a severe element of anti-Judaism. The Jews, he said, are disliked and hated in those parts of Eastern Europe and Russia, not because they prayed differently, not because they believe differently, because they are a parasitic race, a classic sort of racial anti-Semitic viewpoint. And she took this personally, and she identified with her people, and she turned herself into writing poetry on behalf of the Jewish people of the world. In response directly to this particular writing, she said, "I am all Israel's now. I have no thought, no passion, and no desire except for my people." And she recalled the heroism of the Maccabees and calls upon the Jews to emulate their example. Her later poetry is completely different from her earlier works. When, she said, quoting, when the wrongs of her people filled her with indignation and brought her forward as a champion of an oppressed race. She noted the increase in anti-Semitism. She rejected the idea that the religion of the Jewish people was somehow a relic of the past. But the fact is that Jews are, she said, I may not be an observant Jew, in the language of the time, I may not be an observer of the ritual of the Jew, but I recognize what Jewish people are and what they do. And she said there in America that we are, quoting, the most frequent pioneers of progress, and we lead the world, she said, in justice and in charity. For the Jews were known, even if they didn't get along with the Eastern European Jews that were coming to America, would nonetheless pour ideas of justice, not only for Jews, but for also for others as well, especially for the nascent Black community in America as well as it was developing. They were sharp defenders of everything to do with justice for the Black people, and they would also work in giving enormous amounts of charity. She also saw a necessity for the Jewish homeland for Eastern European Jews, and if not Palestine, well, somewhere else. Now, unlike must remember that the Jewish community in America, and similarly in Germany and also here in England, there was a difference of opinion between the Jews who came from Germany, Western Europe, and those that emanated from Eastern Europe. And in the main, the German Jews saw themselves as superior, better, higher quality, more valued, more acceptable. And Eastern European Jews, well, they didn't quite muster. And there was an antagonism towards them. But she, Emma Lazarus, felt no prejudice, even though she came from the very background that we're alluding to, this affluent German Jewish background. She felt no prejudice and antagonism toward the masses of impoverished ghetto Jews. In fact, she sees them as purer. And this is often common, and we'll see when we come to the First World War, when German Jews first came to Eastern Europe, that when they met up with these Jews, they'd never come across Jews like that. And yet they saw them in some ways as being purer and more authentic. Emma Lazarus did not only write on behalf of the Jews, but she involved herself in the work of those arriving at the islands and raised funds for them. And the writer Abraham Kahan, which you can buy a book about him, he was the editor of The Forward and many famous works of the Yiddish Jewish world. He said, "When I arrived, the immigration committee included one wealthy young Jewish lady who belonged to the cream of the moneyed aristocracy, and she was Emma Lazarus. But all of her background, and all of I said, and all of her works, and all of her translation, and all of her poetry will be totally outshone. For her most famous poem, and the one that guaranteed her immortality, was actually written to raise money. There was a competition on how to raise money for the new immigrants and parts of the Statue of Liberty. And this was a competition which she did not want to enter. She was not interested in writing poetry of this style. Now, the technique to raise money was by auctioning manuscripts by famous American authors, which she did not see herself as, to adorn the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty, which she called the Mother of Exiles, another name for it. And she, as I said, reluctantly sent a poem, which was actually a classic 14-line sonnet, which she called the New Colossus. And it is based on the Colossus of the Greek story of the island of Rhodes in the 3rd century BCE, and the twin cities that story speaks of is now the story of the twin cities. They were not joined at the time, of New York and Brooklyn, which were two separate cities. And that would be affixed to the pedestal in 1903, 16 years after her death. It went like this. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here at our sea-washed sunset gate shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glowed worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-breathed harbor that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lids. Then, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, the tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. And if the 14 lines of it were not the most famous 14 lines of a sonnet, those lines, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. These 4 lines of that 14-line sonnet would become famous in all America for all time, even when people today don't know where they come from originally. And it's interesting to see that even writers of music can use these lines as part of their music. Irving Berlin was singing to it in a film which he's involved in. His singing was terrible, but otherwise the lines were used. And it is used by communities throughout America. It was sung in churches and all the different communities. Now, her life would be known for those lines, but the life of her was racked with pain. In the year that her father died in 1885, she was only young, she was born in 1849, and the last time she there was suffering severely with cancer, which was untreatable. She traveled to Europe in her last days, her last years, because she wanted to experience a relationship with those lands there. On her deathbed, she did not call for the rabbi of her synagogue, which was Eretz Yisrael, the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue in New York City, but the leader of what was known at the time as the ethical culture movement, which was a humanist movement. She died in 1887 at just the age of 38. Her death brought enormous expressions of respect, enormous number of obituaries all over the world. Memorials were published and Robert Browning sent condolences. Today, in reality, this lady, Emma Lazarus, is little known. Her poetry is forgotten, but her poem inscribed in a plaque on the Statue of Liberty. That means that she is honored and remembered and will be immortalized by all of us here today and others, immortalized for all time. Thank you very much. And for those who are local, I will be speaking on an anniversary this Saturday in Norris Lee Synagogue at 11:20 on the Kilts pogrom, entitled "The War Had Ended, but the Holocaust had not." I look forward to seeing you all very soon. Have a wonderful day.